Welcome everyone to 23rd episode of BeyondPhrenology. And today we have with us Rob Gray. Rob Gray is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University. Though he is in the psychology department, a lot of his interests lie in skill development and motor learning. He has an undergraduate from Queen's University, Canada, followed by a PhD from York. He's not just a prolific scientist, he has written several books. I recently read one of his books. It's called How We Learn to Move, a very interesting read. Another one is Learning to Optimize Movements. And you can see on the screen, he has a third book called A Constraint-Led Approach to Baseball Coaching. So as the title suggests, Rob is a consultant in the sports industry. He brings in a very special expertise in ecological psychology to do skill training and coaching in sportsmen. And as the title says, the constraint-led, I think, Rob, we have some common shared interest as well as influences like Carl Newell, who began the work from the constraint-led approach in motor control. So we'll definitely discuss that at some point. So Rob, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. My pleasure to be here.
And Rob, you also run a very popular podcast. Okay. Can you tell us a little about
yeah, so it's called the Perception and Action Podcast. It's been going for quite a while. I started as kind of just a way to add to my teaching, and it took off and kind of it's 400 and something episodes strong. So yeah, I do it weekly. It's a lot of fun.
Right. How do students feel about it? I mean, taking class with a professor who has a very popular podcast, it might be a different kind of attitude towards you, right?
Yeah, I think for the most part, students enjoy, they can get some of the material in a different form than, always watching videos and things. They can listen to it while they're driving or exercising or something. So yeah, I think it's for the most part, it's been pretty successful. Yeah.
That's great work. So Rob, would you tell a little bit about how you came across the whole suite of ecological ideas and how you got enmeshed in the ecological community and ventured on this kind of work?
Yeah, you mentioned my background is in psychology. I did a lot of work in visual perception. I was trained in the traditional information processing kind of approach to things. I guess also when I was undergrad, I had a supervisor, Barry Frost, who used to study animals, and he looked for a mechanism that were detecting tau, time to collision, which is a very ecological. So he got me interested in Gibson. I started reading it, and then over time, I just came more and more interested. I had I read more and more and started to understand it more and more. When you just mentioned, you just had Bill Warren on. Bill Warren was a big influence on me. I liked him because he put a lot of effort into making it understandable, I thought. And, so I really enjoyed his work on, stair climbing and navigation and showing that you could get the same kind of control behavior without a controller. That was this fundamental idea. And then when I started getting into sports and trying to apply my work in, working with baseball teams and different sports, just started to make a lot of sense to me. So that's kind of a long history of slowly turning to more and more Gibson side.
Right. So were there any moments of epiphany, like you met people or you read certain books, given that you said that you started from a very cognitive information processing training? Normally some kind of baptization happens, when people come to ecological psychology. So
a couple, so I one of the things I always say is that Claudia Carrillo and Claire Michaels' book Direct Perception. I read that first time I read that was kind of like eye-opening. I was lucky. I was in Marseille for a while, and I had a lot of good discussion with Reinoud Bootsma, who's very in your face about one of the, I always joke about, his quote was, I'm interested in catching. When you catch a ball, it's just as serious if you lose your hand as if someone cuts off your head, right? People are obsessed with the brain, The
Right.
mechanics of how you move your hand are just as important. That's what he was
Right.
trying to emphasize to me. And so a lot of good discussions with him and Bill. And yeah, so I there are a lot of little things that kind of I saw, and then discovering Bernstein's work on the other side, the motor side of things. So kind of not so much big epiphanies, but this kind of slow build I had. Yeah.
Right. Right. Accumulating and then finally
Yeah.
leading to.
Yeah.
So when was it the first time that you entered the field, ecopsych? Or
So I was the first kind of, I always say that a really message I got from Gibson is, perception action coupling. You need to study them together.
right.
So that's where I got interested in simulation, virtual reality. So I was very early adopter of sports simulation, driving
Yeah.
simulation, because it just made sense to me. You need to keep them together.
Right.
And so after I started doing some work, I started to go to some conferences, ecological psychology. And the way I was speaking about it was still very cognitive information. So I used to get shot down a little at those conferences.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was an interesting experience. But yeah, that's kind of where it started,
Right.
and kind of exploring things like that. And then, I say I spent a lot of time making models, understanding how the cognitive of like a baseball bat, or how the perception and cognition work. And then when I went to work with teams and actually apply it, I realized, what do I do with this? Like, I can't really use
Yeah.
it to help this player right in front of me.
Right.
So that was really an eye opener for me too.
Right. 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 No, no, that's definitely great. So you talked about the Direct Perception book by Claudia Carrello and Claire Michaels. Are you still? I feel that has been the best book in terms of eye-opening and introducing ecological psychology, and there
Mhm.
hasn't been any of that impact since then.
Mhm.
Do you use it in your coursework, or do you use it as part of your
I
material?
Yeah, I used to use it a little bit, and that was one I would always recommend.
Yeah,
Now, I think I would, just the ecological psychology side of things, I might change that to the recent one by Jeff Wagman and
yeah.
Julia Blau. That's really good.
Introduction to ecological
Yeah.
psychology.
And then my book, How to Learn to Move, was my effort to try to pull it into how we apply it to sports and ecology, that to like an entry point. But yeah, that's one of the first and best, I think. But it does get into some pretty tricky concepts too, even though it's a kind of a good general introduction. Yeah.
It does. It does. It remains much more. Uh, it's much more technical than the recent one, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And sometimes probably a little bit challenging for a first year undergrad student.
Yeah, it just the challenge with the ecological, what understanding cognitive approach, and it just makes sense. Like, people know what memory is. People know what they think
Yeah.
they know what it is supposed to be. Ecological psychology turns all of that on its head. So the very foundation, your understanding of what time is and what
Yeah.
memory is, it's all different. So it's very hard go, I find it took me many, many passes at the same thing to kind of fully grasp these ideas. Yeah.
Right. So you are one of those few people, who are in psych departments, and of course, there have been departments like the one at UConn, the one in
Mm-hmm.
Cincinnati, and Merced, who have like several people from the ecopsych
Mm-hmm.
community, and ASU is not that kind of a place, right? It's mostly cognitive processing, and it has been a very heavily, like, some big shots have
Mm-hmm.
come out, in that field from ASU.
Yeah, we have,
So
for sure, we have a small
yeah,
growing kind of groundswell of dynamical systems,
right,
particularly in team communications and things like
yeah,
that. But yeah, for the most part, you're right.
right.
Pretty
So
traditional.
so 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 what kind of challenges do you face, and like what has your your pedagogy has kind of morphed into now when you're trying to impart this kind of ideas to your students at ASU?
Yeah, I find it's challenging because I find, like, we, as the ecological side of things, you always have to start. How was it different than the traditional approach? And you're kind of building and criticizing, and it takes a lot of effort and time to do that. Almost every
Yeah,
paper you write, it seems like you have to do that. And What I've tried to do in my podcast now is just, okay, let's just start. We're all
Yeah.
on the ecological side. Here's the start. So yeah, so a lot of, I guess I kind of do, I started by doing a very traditional approach and then adding a few lectures on ecological approach. Now I try to weave them in both sides throughout,
Yeah.
compare and contrast. I think that's, I think it still helps to kind of have both in
Hmm.
some ways, yeah. But in a way, I want to just do an ecological a course, a whole thing, without
Right, right,
any
right,
reference
right,
but I haven't done that yet. So we'll see if I ever
right.
get that far. Yeah.
So does it ever happens, like student comes like, oh, that professor is saying that we have short-term memory, long-term memory, medium-term memory, and executive memory, and whatever, 50 kinds of memories. And
Hmm.
then you have Claudian Carrillo, arguing that there's no distinction in memory. Who gets to decide, what is short-term and long-term?
Yeah.
Uh, uh, so does it come like, are you correct or is the other professor correct? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, you get a little bit about that. I get a lot of people and I get a lot of coaches and
yeah,
things like that too. Okay, how do I talk about muscle memory? That concept that's been around
yeah,
forever.
right,
Um, and yeah, so you do, and you kind of have memories. I have a episode where we talked about it's a very hard thing to simply explain the
yeah,
ecological approach of how memory fits in. So yeah, you do get some of that. Definitely get some people with a strong view, and students come to you. If this told me that, and you told me this, and um, I just I try to get them to think, that this is an alternative, right? It's just like that is an alternative. That's
right,
the kind of most fundamental problem I have with a lot of this stuff is, especially as it applied to things like coaching,
yeah,
is we've had it for so long, we've forgotten that cognitive psychology is a theory, just like ecological psychology is a theory, right? It's
yeah.
treated
That's
as if
true.
it's fact, and it now, because it's been around so long. Like you
Right,
get better by repeating the same thing over and over is a fact, right? It's not
right,
an assumption anymore. So I'm
right.
getting people just hopefully just think about it and challenge their ideas.
So if we ecological psychologists, remain active for a long time, we might achieve the same status.
Maybe, yeah, yeah. I think there's getting some ground, especially with some of the application.
Yeah.
Um, some of the more, recent ones that are exciting me, they're starting to apply some of the ideas in martial arts training, which is a very opposite of that, and training police officers, which is really exciting.
Now, could
And
you give some examples?
so instead of training a police officer on how to shoot and the mechanics of everything, training focused on picking up affordances, detect what's this situation afford in terms of dangers and how to stop this situation, right? So training them to be more adaptable and to the kind of chaos they face every day, instead of this is the one move I know how to do.
Right.
I practice many times.
Okay.
Same with martial arts kind of thing. So
But someone can argue, right, that has not much to do with eco-psych or ecological theory. Cognitive psych, a traditional information processing person might come and say, like, oh, we are just training them with higher order variables now.
yeah, yeah, I guess so. I guess, but I think it just, to me, it's just a simpler way than trying to come up with yeah, than get learning these, and we certainly don't practice it that way and train it that way. Yeah.
Right, right, right.
Mhm.
And then that makes sense.
Mhm.
So one of the things which is fascinating about your work and it makes you wonder, when you read your stuff is why is it that I mean, if you look at where ecosec is more applied right now, it's mostly in the sports domain, not so much in the clinic, but more in the sports domain and training domain. You and there are people in Europe,
Mhm.
several groups now. So how is it that the information processing approaches have still remained the dominant paradigms in laboratory neuroscience, laboratory psychology, and ecopsych is coming out of the labs and being
Mhm.
applied to the real world, especially in the domain of sports.
Yeah, I think, and there's also, it's been applied to kind of physiotherapy and injury rehabilitation
Yeah,
too. But yeah, no, I know what you're saying, and I like to think this might, obviously I'm biased, but I like to think it resonates. The word I use is resonates with a lot of coaches. Like a lot of coaches I've talked to have been good coaches. I've been doing a lot of these ideas for a long time. I'm just giving them a theory to hang it on, a framework to hang it on, and how to expand it. So it just makes sense to a lot of people, I think, in the applied side. On the neuroscience and the laboratory, there's almost an industry, kind of built up around, we were talking before we went on there about grant funding, about industry of research on moving through a force field, right? And doing little variations of that, which on the ecological side is that's not a task we probably ever study, right? So we don't really have much to say about that. And
I
it's
call
kind of
it the
like,
neuroscience industrial complex.
yeah, I think I call it sciencing. Sometimes you make up some
Sciencing.
task and you add that's so far removed from anything from the real world. I
Yeah.
try to say it applies to the real world, but
Yeah.
I don't
And
really do that.
every reviewer knows the task, so they give you the funding, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to build on what you've done before and a well-defined task.
So
Yeah.
so I applied for an R15, the one which I was discussing, and I just got a summary statement. One of the criticism is, some of the criticism are okay, and I can address. One of the criticism is that this whole paradigm, a person is standing and doing a trail making task, a real life size basically on a projector screen. There are not previous studies on which this builds.
Yeah.
What does it mean? Does it mean that we cannot start first studies to begin with, or does it mean that for first few studies we do not fund you? We will fund you only when the things are done and you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, I had a lot of the similar things with, understanding virtual tasks, baseball batting, like, or no, we can't understand that. It's too complicated.
That's
We got
not
to go
allowed.
back to reaching to something on a table.
That's not allowed. Yeah.
It's so far removed that
You need to have a manipulandum, and you need to move manipulandum like this.
Yeah, it has no. I personally believe those studies have no implications whatsoever for real world things. But I know a lot of people they make strong cases that they do, and they have very well defined models of the behavior, and they can manipulate these things. So I think it's appealing. It's kind of safe work. I would say it's not really pushing the boundaries. But it's just me being grumpy about funding. So
no, it ensures your summer salary. I had this on this podcast on my second episode. I had Louis Barrett, and we were discussing how much research would change if we have the summer salary out of the grants. If researchers get paid like for 12 months instead of 9, then probably we will have more novel research and new ideas get funded. Certainly.
The incentive system is kind of strange here in the US.
That's true. So yeah, that explains, Rob. That explains. Do you really think that a lot of what we do with manipulandums, sensory motor weighting, and adaptation, like, don't see any of that being ever applied to sports?
Not a lot of it, I think, and there's a little bit of this on the ecological side, to be fair. Like there's a lot of swinging pendulums, right?
Yeah.
Coordination. A lot of the work on Kelso's work on coordination stuff is about swinging pendulum. It's unlike anything real world task. So there's the same problem on the, to be fair.
Yeah.
I think from what we see, I think a lot of them are, you're lacking coordination problem of multiple degrees of freedom. It's very simple. The constraints are super simple and defined, unlike some like playing tennis, where it's just like every bone, every muscle in your body is involved in the. I think there may be little things, but I think there's a lot of research. Gabby Wolf and I think it was Shea had a paper a long time ago where they looked at what we can learn about complex tasks from simple tasks, and they defined the two, and they showed the answer was nothing. But so I think they're very limited. I think, and it frustrates me because we have so many tools now to study, like complex behavior. We have motion tracking, and why don't we just do that, right?
There's a call in like for example, one of the famous ones for John Krakauer in Neuron, neuroscience need behavior, and there have been calls like that, every year, and those papers get actually very heavily cited. Like you write that neuroscience needs behavior, or we need more ecological stuff while you are a neuroscientist. It will get you 1,000 citations or something in a year. But when you actually look for, like, just go to NIH and ask, like, oh, what are the grants which people are studying, like whole body thing and, like coordination or something like that. I mean, there's almost nothing.
Yeah, no, I
So
agree. Yeah, it's a little frustrating how,
it's,
and
it's
the unwritten story is that we're going to move from moving through a force field to playing tennis, right? This is a necessary first step, but at the
yes.
rate we're going, it's going to take 5,000 years, right? To get to actual like we're still doing, like we're moving super slowly, like to getting to the real thing.
Yeah, that you're right. So
Yeah.
I mean, science progresses one funeral at a time, right?
Yeah.
So there are
Yeah.
labs when they started in 1980s and 90s, started with force field, and they still do force field. It's just that now they're starting recording from the neurons as well in the brain.
Yeah.
So you have force field along with neural recordings.
Yeah, and that
So
seems,
yeah,
to be really cynical, that seems like
yeah,
that's a field that's driven by the technology, not a technology that people found to answer a question, right? They found, oh, we have this way to create these force fields. What kind of questions can we answer with them?
with the force field.
Which is the
Yes.
wrong way to do science, I think, right? Come up with the questions, then you think about
Find
how
out the
you can,
tools.
yeah, yeah.
And if you look at the career of scientists, the way, in those two paradigms, in one case, you would see the person using the same method and asking different questions. In the other way, you will see the person addressing the same big question, but trying to recruit as many methods as required to answer those questions, no matter what.
Yeah. And I do, I do sympathize with a little bit with, the problem we have in motor learning is the tasks are so different that people have studied, and you can't really like I've done a lot of baseball ones and
Yeah.
VR and stuff. Like we talk about replication is a big issue. Like nobody could replicate my studies. It'd be impossible. They couldn't have the same exact, so I do understand a little bit of the motivation for having a clear paradigm, and I think it can be beneficial. I just wish it was a little closer to a real action.
Right.
That's the only thing. Yeah.
So what are the questions in motor control, Rob? Like, for instance, okay, so when I give presentations, a lot of times I bring in four ideas actually, three traditional ones. One of the ideas is the EPH, equilibrium point hypothesis. And again, we are not talking about people here. We are more interested in the criticism and the limitation of the ideas. I mean, people might be doing in good or bad faith. That's a different issue. The second is the idea of internal models, the internal and forward models, which remain at the level of algorithm. Because when they talk about, like, oh, we have a sensory prediction we have the prediction of the sensory consequence of self-made actions. Now, when you ask, like, what do you mean by prediction of sensory consequence? You mean it is predicting the exact same, afferent signals? Is it predicting some higher order effect? Like, what exactly it is predicting, right? And
Yeah.
where? Those questions remain unanswered despite 40 years of predictive models. And then the third framework, Latash's UCM, right?
Yeah.
Which works in a very constrained, and when you imagine that there's a time asymmetry and you apply other assumptions, you can find good versus bad variability, and you can decompose that very conveniently in certain tasks, and assuming that there is actually an endpoint which is controlled.
Yes.
Right, which is a big assumption, often unfounded. And then now you have this work in ecopsych based on scale independent and interactions across scales based ideas, which involves a lot of fractal and multi-factor analysis and more looking at those interactions basically. So where do you see, and what paradigms of these you see are actually there to be able to address the big questions in motor control, or will they be able
Yeah.
to?
So I'm a big fan of the UCM, the uncontrolled manifold approach. We're just kind of we're just planning some new studies with that. I just think it makes sense to me. It essentially captures Bernstein's idea of repetition without repetition. Right. It makes a lot of sense. You're right. There's a lot of assumptions and hidden things in it that, so So we're trying to work on can we constrain it a little bit and get a, but I see a lot of potential in that.
But it definitely is light years ahead of the whole idea of logical dance of forward models
Yeah,
because
I
it
think
looks at
so. I think,
variability. Yes.
yeah, equilibrium point hypothesis. Honestly, I haven't done enough with to kind of see what potential. I know everyone, in terms of the predicting the sensory consequences of I know everybody's very big, high on active inference
Yeah.
and predictive processing now. Again, I honestly haven't done enough to see what you can and can't do with them. They just don't kind of fit with what I believe, so I don't really dig in. Although I do plan to do an episode on try to explain them from my view in at some point, but a podcast episode. But yeah, so I kind of like the kind of the different dynamic across time scales, like fractal, recurrence analysis, and those seem really interesting to me. They're kind of beyond my math level in some ways.
Yeah.
So they're I haven't done too much with those either, but I think there's some great work with those too.
But are they? Is the idea of prediction compatible with this constraint-based and ecological approach in general?
So we're actually right now, Andrew Wilson is, from Exeter, who's a big ecological psychology. We're actually working together with a group of people on comparing predictive versus perspective. And I'm finding what people mean by predictive is not what I mean. And so I find that like controlling your behavior so it looks anticipatory, which is what happens in perspective control. A lot of people consider that predictive, which I don't. But so I think it depends on your definition. And I think strictly prediction, I don't think it's necessary, and I think it has a lot of problems. But I think some of the more advanced ones, we'll see what comes out of that. We're all kind of debating back and forth, so we'll see what comes out of that. Yeah.
I see. And what are the big problems in motor control you see in general? Like what exactly are we working towards? Like what exactly is the theory trying to address?
So, for me, the fundamental problem is, Bernstein's problem, the degrees of freedom problem. How do we organize? How do we coordinate the body to make this move? And that's a lot of the problem I have with a lot of the models, right? They don't have a really well threshed out motor component, right? It's almost like there's a button, now move, right? After the perceptual problems all solved and
Yeah.
the cognitive problems. They don't really say about what aspect of movement is controlled and when and how in a lot of the movements. So that's the big, whereas perspective control, I control this aspect of my steering rate. Like I was really big influenced by Bill Warren and Brett Fagen's navigation models and things,
Yeah.
because they talked about this is the information, this is how the movement's controlled. And so I like you're doing both sides of it. So that's a problem I see with a lot of predictive models. And that was the problem I had when I went from the lab to the field, right? So I had a model of how baseball players might predict what pitch is coming and things. And I realized all I really did is take the problem of perception to a problem of, okay, I perceived a fast, the ball pitch is a fastball to, I predict it's a fastball.
Right.
Who's looking at that prediction? What do I do with it? Right.
Right.
That's lacking, I think, in a lot of the models I see. There's some that address it for sure, but I think there's a lot of limitations. That's
Is
the
it
biggest
is it even biologically tenable? I mean, what is the velocity at which a baseball comes? Like, let's say,
so
maximum.
upwards
Yeah.
of 100 miles an hour, some of them. So we're
Right.
talking, yeah, they're there
So
less than half a second. Yeah.
half a second
Yeah.
from the pitcher to the
Yeah.
batter,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, and where do we understand where when exactly the batter makes a decision of swing the bat?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think there's a discrete, I think there's a lot of late adjustments they make and
Yeah.
things like that where, and there is some evidence, you have to make it in the 150, 200 milliseconds. You have to, in baseball, it's really, you're deciding not to swing because you kind of start it on every trial and if you didn't, you'd be too slow and then you stop it. But yeah, it's very, very
Very small, right?
Yeah.
So does it have like, is that time consistent with the neurophysiological ideas that it should take this amount of milliseconds to go from, eyes to V1, then V1 to V2, then V2 to V3, and
Yeah, not in the traditional way we think about it. I think, I've been really influenced a lot by, like Michael Turvey's idea of like strong anticipation
yeah,
and that, where you can get this behavior that looks like, and actually the delays create this behavior where you're kind of, and you're looks like you're anticipating, but you're just coupling two systems and coupling the system of the ball and your movement, and creating this anticipatory looking behavior without any prediction. So, which is hard. I know that's hard to understand, but that's kind of the basic idea. Yeah. But yeah, so it is the delays actually are helpful in the system, but most people think, yeah, you have to start swinging this time because you're gonna have this
yeah,
long
right.
delay before
You're
you
right.
can actually move
That
and
that
things.
that question itself is a very information
Yeah,
processing driven query.
yeah. So yeah, the kind of the delays in the system, I think it depends on how you're using it.
Right.
Yeah.
And same thing is in group coordination. So let's say we are talking about soccer, uh, uh, and you have these individuals interacting, right? And they also have like different trajectories, while those trajectories kind of intersect each other as well. So do you
Yeah.
think we're talking about a delayed kind of a system there as well?
Um, I don't. I think the delays get built in. Yeah, when you're kind of when you're controlling prospectively, when you're controlling coupling to the system. I don't think the delays have the same meaning as they do in a traditional view. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So a couple of things you can talk about your book. Uh, the first two popular ones as well as the more specialized one for baseball training.
Mhm. Yeah. So the first one, how we learn to move, was kind of I got asked a lot. I'm interested in applying ecological psychology to sports. Where should I start? There's a lot of great books out there. A lot of them are very heavy going, a lot of theory, and so I wanted to kind of write it as a kind of introducing the concepts of Bernstein, self-organization, affordances from Gibson's side, and showing kind of all the ways all the implications it has. So I did that, and then the second one, learning to optimize movement, I get into more information. What's information from a Gibsonian perspective? What's perspective control? It's a little more detailed. And then the baseball one's just more obviously baseball specific, but how we can guide. Like I think about guiding self-organization an athlete using constraints, right? Rules
And
and
how
rules.
exactly? Like, could you provide some examples on that?
So, instead of telling baseball batter, oh, I want you to do this with your foot when you swing, we just put something you have to step over when you swing, right? So we create this kind of new constraint on the task, and you have to figure out how to be successful in taking it into account without us telling you. I don't, trying to move away from the traditional approach of coaches telling athletes what to do, because for a couple of reasons. One, it gets you focusing internally, which we know is not good for performance. And two, coaches don't always know for that individual what the best way to swing or something is. So we try to, what constraints can we add to practice to kind of guide people
Right,
to find the best way for them.
right. So there's no interpretation by the coach, for instance, like how the person would navigate a particular constraint. Rather, you just put a constraint and let it self-organize based on the conditions of the, of the sportsman and.
Yeah, there's some they're kind of chosen. Good coaches kind of see what you're doing, and a good constraint kind of is designed to take away if they don't like what you're doing or it's not
Yeah.
effective. Take away that and encourage you to look for something else. Yeah.
So is there any evidence that this kind of approach works better? Like, are there clinical trial kind of comparisons?
Yeah, there's kind of a growing evidence that constraints. I have some in baseball where I've done, compared, constraints versus direct instruction, and we find, we get better outcomes in the end. There's been a few studies, some on kind of differential learning, in soccer, kind of constraint of manipulating the number of players, the size of the field have shown to be effective, small-sided games, things like that. So yeah, there's kind of a slowly growing body of evidence.
I see. And how well received are the books so far? Especially the
Good.
one,
I
the
think
popular
they've been
ones.
fairly popular. I think, I've got a lot of good feedback, and I think people enjoy the ideas. And yeah, so it's been fun getting people thinking about this
Right.
different way. Like I think like I said at the start, a lot of people, coaches, when I approach them, like they're like, I don't need a theory of motor learning,
Right.
to coach. My answer is you already have one. You're not bringing it to the surface, right? You have one built on repetition, prescriptive
Right.
instruction, telling you just don't think about it, right? So I just want you to acknowledge it and maybe think of it slightly different ways. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
By the way, how do these repetitions fit in with like repetitions without repetitions, the Bursteinian way versus what is the equivalent of that in information processing, by the way? Like what do repetitions do?
So the idea is, so there's a couple things. One is, right, in the information processing, the idea, you're training to build this motor program, this
Yeah.
in the stored memory structure for how to do the skill. And any kind of variability in how knee angle, for example, when you serve a tennis ball, that's noise, right? We want to get rid of that. And that's part of what repetitions do. Over time, you're going to be able to execute the motor program more
You
consistently.
go towards a mean, some kind
Yeah.
of, you achieve a
Yeah.
convergence.
And you learn, you get to program parameterize the motor program better, and you get more consistent,
Yeah.
less variable performance. Yeah, I think that's the main, kind of thing we think repetition. And then repetition gets you to learn this one way to do it. Like how that you refine your motor program of the optimal way to serve a tennis ball.
Right. And
That's kind of and then I think your motor program gets richer and stronger and
so
more.
that's the information
Yeah.
processing framework. And how and what's the role of repetitions in the ecological framework?
So the fundamental idea in the ecological approach is there's not one way to do it, right? Because the constraints are always changing. You need multiple ways to do it. So you're not building this representation or memory structure in your head of how to perform the skill. You're learning to adapt to these different situations, right? So we're performing the same skill, I'm just looking at a basketball picture right here. Performing the same basketball shot over and over and over and over is a waste by yourself from the same spot, is not an effective use of practice, right? Because in a game, you have to perform that shot while you're on the move. Someone's in your face
Right.
while you're dribbling. So why don't we practice those things, right? Get
Right.
you to be more adaptable. So the fundamental idea, is Bernstein's. You need to be able to repeat the outcome
Yeah.
of getting the ball in the hoop, but you don't do that by repeating the same movement, right? And that's what he found with his blacksmiths he studied, where they're not repeating the same hammer
Right.
stroke to hit the same
Right.
spot
And
because
in
the
fact, there are
constraints are changing. Yeah.
right. In fact, there are studies, for instance, Blanda and Brill's group, that experts show more variability in their movements across trials than sometimes novices, and that variability allows them actually to
Yeah,
converge
for
the
sure.
final task constraint
Yeah.
or task demands. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have a quote I use in my first book. It's Rafael Nadal, the tennis player. He says,
Yeah.
I've never hit the same shot in tennis twice. Like there's always something different. I'm slightly different, more tired. The ball bounces different. It's a different surface. Like, so he
Yeah.
captures that idea perfectly. Not all athlete quotes are useful. Sometimes they have different beliefs, but that I like that one a lot.
Right. Right. So any connection with like like Olympic level or really, I'm not into sports, sorry.
Okay.
Like in tennis, I think it's Wimbledon, right? And US Open. I mean, do you see this kind of work reaching to that level of coaching right now, or is it more at a grassroots level?
No, I think it's starting to break in. I work in professional baseball and football right now. I work with some Olympics. I think people are starting that they like these ideas. Like in Olympic hockey, right? One of the problems we have with a lot of from the ecological perception is or soccer or something is in practice, you never let players make decisions, right? They always know what's going to happen. They pass it here, shoot then, right? And then in the game, you get frustrated because they're not good decision makers. So like that. So that idea of kind of adding more decisions to practice, changing things, I think that's appealing to a lot of coaches. So yeah, it's starting to gain hold in a lot of areas.
Right. That's nice. So now coming back to your lab, you mentioned that you have been working on driving simulation, and you also have done some work with flight simulators. And basically, you're trying to simulate more ecological and real world situations in the lab in different contexts, where our technology can assist. I guess you also use virtual reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you tell what does your lab look like? What kind of experiments are you doing, and what are the sources of funding for your research?
Yeah, so when I started, so I sometimes call that the paying the bills research, right? So when I started out, especially getting funding to do a sports study was not very easy to come by, right? To justify making a baseball player better,
Yeah.
right? It's not, NSF doesn't really want to fund that. So what I would do, I started out realizing I better define performance more broadly. So I talked about driving, there's so many driving accidents every year. So can we make safer drivers? So I've done a lot of kind of perception things in driving, like making left turns in front of traffic. I did a lot of work, the early work on driver warnings, the sounds and vibrations you get in your car when you're going to hit something or go out of your lane. I've had ones that are kind of like trying to create almost like a Tao auditory version of Tao. I did a few years ago. And flight simulation too, kind of understanding the control of flight. One of the things I've looked at a lot in flight is kind of how pressure and anxiety influence performance. So looking at different constraints on performance. Early work wasn't as much. That was kind of before I was more ecological like I am now. So a lot of it was a lot of that work is actually testing information processing ideas. A lot of my early work in those areas, and sports too.
Okay.
I've done a lot of work in that area.
And even now, is it testing the information processing ideas?
Not so much. Now it's really kind of more focused on comparing and looking for evidence of like constraints that approach and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. And you're seeing this in driving as well?
Yeah. I think so. Looking for the kind of variability and things like that. I haven't done as much in that area as I've done in sports, but I've kind of moved away. Now I've kind of moved away a little bit from driving and aviation related work, and what I really wanted to do all along was sports. So I'm doing more of that now.
And what are the sources of funding for your lab, Rob, right now, other than
So
consultancy?
initially it was mostly NSF, studying. I always made the justification that I was using sports and driving as paradigms to study motor control.
Yeah.
Just like people use robotic force fields, like we talked about. That was my justification. I was able to make that successfully sometimes, but for most of my, and then now more kind of, company like car companies sometimes, and sports organizations, things like that sometimes have funding for testing certain things. So it's more kind of industry based, I would say now. I moved away from as opposed to
is it a viable option? I mean, it's working for you right now, but in terms of the resources, do you see, like, for a person like me, like much younger than you, and still trying to scramble resources to run the lab, do you think that approach can be as lucrative in terms of recruitment and in terms of the work as the primary NIH and NSF is?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess on the one hand, I always, I think like you should look for funding, like you invest your money, like diversify anywhere you can get it. But yeah, well, if it is very hard. I think there's two things. One, it took me a lot of years to make the relationships to kind of get in there. And also, I think on a university level, they probably wouldn't look as favorably on industry funding as an NSF career grant or something. You should focus on that pretty heavily when you're young, I think. So yeah, I think it is a difficult way to go, I think, relying on these things. There's more kind of constraints on it too, in terms of IP and all these issues. You have to dance around with your funding agency, which is kind of challenging. But yeah, I think it is tough road.
Okay. So Rob, any plans for attending the next EcoSci conferences? I haven't seen you, so I was wondering if...
So I was briefly at ICPA in the past one in Guadalajara.
You were there?
I wasn't there for very long because I was part of a family trip. So
okay, I see. Well, I was there, but I didn't get to see you there.
Yeah, and I think maybe, I'm not sure when the next one is, and I think there's talk of the next European one.
Yeah, that's in
Norway.
In Norway. Yeah, that's 2024.
I might try if I can figure out where I'm going to be then, and I might try to go to that. So yeah, I'd like to get back more into those and give it an applied flavor. More recent years, I've gone to more specific, like sports specific meetings and things like that instead of the general ones. But I do miss going to those. Yeah.
Right. No, it's very clear that right now you're much more focused on applying than actually debating about the core. Core ideas.
For sure. Yeah.
Especially the tussle between representational and non-representational, which has become my favorite pastime for some time now.
Yes, you can make a career out of just arguing about that back and forth. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Well, I don't know, maybe.
Well, I wish that was possible, and if it was possible to move the needle in the other direction.
Yeah. Yes.
Especially in the cognitive sciences departments.
Yes, for sure. I can sympathize.
Yeah, Rob, before we end, any new exciting things you're looking forward to?
Not too many, like a lot. So yeah, like you said, a lot of my stuff, so doing applications and stuff. So I do have some, data sets I want to write out, some new kind of UCM things we're working on. Hopefully coming out soon. That big prediction paper, I hope people will find interesting. Those are kind of the main things. And at some point, I do have a third book, and I've started writing, but I don't know when I'm going to have time to get it all finished.
And what's that about?
What I kind of want to focus on, kind of how you can actually use this in coaching. So focus on the coaching side, how to develop coaching skills from an ecological approach. So talking a lot, and how I've interacted with a lot of coaches I see doing it really well. So so that's hopefully what it will be, but I don't know. I need to think about it a bit more.
Right. And by the way, is this your office at ASU, or is this just your home office?
This is my my office at ASU from a weird angle because one of my monitors just died, so I'm off to the side. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a good angle.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And it looks good. Yeah. So thanks, Rob. Thanks for coming to the show, and it was nice getting to know what you're doing and your approach and everything else.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. And talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.